All right, guys, welcome to our show here at RaiseHealth. It's me, your host, Alberto Chan, and I have a special guest today, Amel. Welcome, Amel.
So much. It's great to see you again.
Well, I guess let's try to get a few things off first. Is people are dying to know how you do it. You're this influencer on LinkedIn. You're a physician in Germany. Now you're starting this adventure journey. It's been a year now since we met in Malta about helping fix healthcare. So yeah, how about you give a quick background intro and how do you do this? I think people love it.
Yeah, so already my name is, you already mentioned it, my name is Amel Havkic. I am still a practicing physician. I'm actually the head of a specialized unit in the University Thoracic Center in Frankfurt in the Elisabethen Hospital. But I am also a consultant or advisor in MedTech. I do this already since a few years. How I came to MedTech was actually accidentally, but I fell in love and I made it the topic of my research to basically to look into the reasons or the factors that make products or units in healthcare successful. Based my research on that, and what came out was a framework which you already know. It's the STARMAP framework. Basically, something that helps give a guiding star to everyone looking to have real patient impact. For that framework, we got last year in Malta Best Market Access Consultancy in MedTech 2025. In Dubai, then early this year, me personally, I got the Best Rising Star of the industry, has a little bit something of a Grammy. So, yeah, I'm very proud of that. I'm actually doing this out of passion. I am a doctor, not only by trade, but also by passion. And the reason why I went to MedTech is that I wanted to see a world where every patient, it doesn't matter how their economic status is or their geography, gets the best imaginable care. And what better way to achieve that than through MedTech, right? So, yeah, I view this as basically one ecosystem, one journey with different parts. And I think this is how it is manageable to look so effortless.
Yeah, that's funny in a sense. It's almost like here you see star map. It's aim for the stars and join the journey, right? Because you got to enjoy the journey of being a medtech
Yeah.
entrepreneur.
Indeed. So I think I told you, no, I didn't tell you the story about why it's called a star map. So first, it looks like a constellation, right? And as you know, it's not just one factor that makes a venture successful, it's a multitude. And then we used to navigate the seas by the stars, right? So I found it fitting.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting. It gives a very light and positive tone from this sea of turmoil, which means being a tech entrepreneur. So I think it's very fitting. This is a great segue to, like the theme that everyone wants to hear is what does it take for a tech startup to be successful, to fundraise? And like you said, there's many, many variables, like many stars out there. So I don't know, you want to start with Dawn and then we can keep building it so that we help the audience as they're starting their journey have things to be mindful, things to watch out, stores that set people back. Because it's challenging, right? Like some data will say 90%, some data will say 99% of medtech startups will fail in their lifetime. So
Well, it is a challenging environment, anyways. It's the maybe even the most complex system that was ever built in the world, and it is a system indeed. And I think when you talk to an investor, pretty much every investor would tell you that the important thing is to solve a meaningful problem. I guess you can think of it as if you have a meaningful problem, then you have a big pain. And if you solve a big pain, you already are positioned good to get paid to solve a pain. And I think that's how the bridge is made. Obviously, I'm a bit biased as a doctor. I am looking at the clinical problem first, but we have actually data to back it up. I mentioned just before we started recording our industry report, and we gathered data from 150 plus innovators on the biggest challenges that they're facing. And the biggest challenge indeed, and in my opinion, the only success metric that really matters in healthcare is clinical adoption. Why does it matter? Because if you don't reach the stage of clinical adoption, you will not have a sustainable business model. You can build something up, but as you said, the odds are stacked against you. And if you want to have a sustainable business model, you will have to achieve clinical adoption. And what do I mean with this is your B2B to C users, so the doctors, the medical practitioners, the therapists, they will have to use your solution and accept it as part of their portfolio. And also mentioned in the book that I'm writing, which now we have a final title, it's going to be Fit Before Scale. So you need to fit before you can scale. That's the point, I guess. I also dissect this quite in detail. So when we look at the distribution from our data, number one issue is clinical adoption. Number two issue is funding readiness. Number three issue is, with just 20%, is regulatory, because once you have those two, regulatory is a checkbox that you have to do in order to reach the number three issue, which is scaling operations, with just 13%. And when looking at the distribution, to me, it came clear, and it was something that I was also talking about and convinced also before. We need to get the clinical adoption right so that we know exactly what we solve for and know exactly how much funding we need to get to the second step, right? Then we need to raise that funding to then check the checkbox of regulatory and be able to enter the market. And then we have the issue of scaling the operations. And this is exactly how the distribution looks. And this is exactly how it goes. And funny enough, the clinical adoption, although it's all at go-to-market, so you need to be at the market to know if you're getting adopted or not, it is actually the first issue that you should solve for. And it's quite interesting dynamics because you really need to understand the problem you're solving.
I think you're peeling a lot of onion layers here, and I think it's very important. But my brain is a little slow, so I'm gonna try to tackle one problem at a time. But it's just me. So I heard you saying clinical adoption, right? And I heard you say a lot of market forces. I think this was so interesting. I taught entrepreneurship class this first semester at University of Texas, and I did bring to the class about this. Like, most of the time, what I hear in my years in fundraising is that you have this physician or this PhD with a great idea, and they get clinical adoption in the university hospital that they are at, right? They get the grant funding, and so they have this marketing reports from consultants that saying that, this is definitely a need, but somehow they still don't go to market. And so I think if we could discuss, I think it's even more interesting is the differences between like the Germany and the European healthcare versus the American healthcare. Like, what are these market forces? Because clinical adoption is very straightforward, right? It's like current situation, treatment, outcome A, current situation, treatment, outcome B. Do we have patient improvement, right? And so what are market forces that change the equation? What are we talking about?
Well, you would think it's simple, but it's not, obviously. And the thing is that on first glance, if you think of it very, let's call it sterile, it is an A and B. Like, is this better than what we already have? But when you look at it, healthcare is extremely complex and has tons of stakeholders involved. So just solving the issue of one stakeholder will not get you wide clinical adoption. Let's stick to the example that you just brought. You have a pilot at a big university hospital. So you're already in a bubble. You have a MedTech startup which sees you as priority one. So everything they want to do is have a successful pilot. So they give you all of the support they can muster up to make this work for you and for your IT department. They have a grant, so it's already financed. So they don't have to worry about commercialization at all. And then they have their KOLs, which is probably someone who doesn't do anything else but this specific thing that they are trying to solve for. So he will be convinced from day one. And already you see, when you think through the problem completely, you have all of these points. And in order to bring them together, how I like to think about it is really through the StarMap success factors or constellation points. One is specialization. So you need to solve a meaningful issue deeply enough and not scatter too early too much. But when you're that specialized, you need to cooperate with others and you need to fit the ecosystem. So we have the second constellation point, cooperation ecosystem fit. When you get this right, you improve the predictability of services. So how many patients can I acquire? How many patients can I treat in a certain amount of time? And how to optimize the flow of patients as the moment that they enter the system. So that's predictability of services. And in between is a node, which is workflow alignment. All of these need to somehow fit together and play together. And these handoffs need to be ideally seamless. So when you go through the constellation and you come to a negative point, which is implementation friction, all the things that can go wrong, whether the doctor which needs to sign it off doesn't like it, or the CFO says, okay, we have marginal improvement, but for much more cost, so my profitability takes a hit. I'm saying no. All of those factors, the human factors, the machine factors, doesn't fit into the hospital IT. Their EHR system doesn't have an API to plug in, or they block it, which is a completely different topic. And then you go to the political trends and incentives that are set, and that is ambulantization, digital care. Take care out of the hospital to the patient home, think care anywhere, anytime. That's the incentives. And only then you come to 2 points which spread from there, which is quality of care, which you just mentioned. Does it improve the quality of care at all or not? And economic viability. Is this really a business model which can sustain itself with all the costs and all of the real life challenges and operational challenges that they need to solve? As you can see, it's a very complex system. And those are all the reasons why the pilot can look good, but in the end, you don't have a viable business model and you don't have a real business which can go the distance.
I love this. I think that what you're doing is readdressing the understanding of what is clinical adoption, right? To what I just said. We tend to think that clinical adoption is, does this product make patient outcome better? But what you're saying is there's more variables inside this. And then clinical outcome is just one data point to actually what clinical adoption means, right? And from my funding perspective, clinical adoption will ultimately mean, can I generate revenue or not? And I think you're addressing that from like patient outcomes one, workflows other, even like, is this a university hospital or is this a profit-driven hospital? What are the things that will change within the team dynamics, right? Like you just said, the surgeon may not like it, the CFO likes it, and so what's going to happen inside the hospital? And so ultimately, everything that you're describing, what's coming to me is the reason why I think the healthcare is the way it is. In a way, the way I look at it, we make it so complicated because there are market forces that make money out of the inefficiencies, right? From what I could hear, from a very logical perspective, there's really no decision maker in the healthcare industry when it comes down to improvements. There is so-called democratic decision of what's the standard of care is. But ultimately, we call democratic, we know that the power of lobby, right? And then we go into American medical associations and then who funds them and why they're funding. But ultimately, would you agree that the reason why healthcare is so challenging is because there is no logical step way for a decision?
I do think it's a very important point that you mentioned.
And just because I think it makes sense. Like even a clinical trial, right? We're so organized because inside a clinical trial, you'd have the IRB, right? The Internal Review Board. Inside the Internal Review Board, everyone has their own roles, and then there's the chief, and so it's almost like a company, right? You have the CEO, the CFO, and then ultimately there's one decision maker in a clinical trial. And then you take that clinical trial, you go to FDA or the C, and then the clinical trial will say this passes the hypothesis of the clinical trials, right? And then the FDA will define whether they understood that the safety was there, the toxicity was there, whatever. But when you pass through that, what happens after for your clinical adoption is just like, who do I go to? Who's the man?
Yeah, that's the $100 million question, right? And you describe it actually perfectly. I mean, you described all of these people involved into making one decision. And ultimately, we can look at an analogy for that. When we decide on a treatment for our patient's carcinoma, so a malignant disease, it's not one person deciding because there is so many different factors, there's so many things to consider that we decide those things in tumor boards. We try to lock our antlers in order to reach the best decision for the patient. And why is that? We are talking about a high stakes environment where if something goes wrong, you cannot just opt out. You cannot just say, okay, I'm going to uninstall an app. We're talking about a really impactful decision. And that's why there's so many people involved. There's not one decision maker, because even if there's one decision maker, let's look at it binary, although it's not. The clinical trial passed the internal standards or audits or the goals, the main endpoints that we have for it, or didn't. And then it goes to the FDA, and then the FDA looks at it again. They might decide different, no? So it's extremely complex. And the reality shows in the actual real life data. All of the MedTech solutions, I mean, we are talking with trials, we think automatically pharma, but all of the MedTech solutions ultimately follow the same principles. And that is that it's developed in a lab. No, there's developers, there's IT people sitting in front of a screen, and they are thinking about the logical way to deliver something. So they have a controlled environment, but healthcare is everything else but controlled. I mean, you have so many variables where you don't know, like, how many people will come into the ER today? What will I be busy with? You're talking about people on the brink of burnout, at the edge of their cognitive limits. And that's the actual real life data. And that's what actually decides the wide clinical adoption beyond just someone saying, okay, this is viable and this is not. And from my experience, this was something which was massively underrepresented all the way up until now. And my personal mission is to really display this complexity of these cases, because there's so many variables involved, which you can improve it. We'll probably come to some of the ways how maybe a bit later down the discussion. But it is a really complex system, and the dynamics are not always how you would expect them to be.
Yeah, it's so interesting that ultimately the way I look at this is the reason why businesses are relationships, right? To think that because you get a dollar cheaper, then you're the right decision, right? Like if we're talking about this whole ecosystem of players, how does hospitals make money? Hospitals make money by having surgeries. They're fee for service, right? And so if you're reducing the surgery by saving the system money, the hospital may not be happy, right? So you start thinking like, in a way, it's almost like you have to get the whole people in the same thought process, same culture. Being a fundraising finance guy, I always think I need to follow the money. I need to understand what's the carrot and the stick for everybody. And so one of the times we had a company, had they have this surgery for head, and they were saying that they were going to reduce the number of surgeries and make stuff better, and they weren't getting where they're supposed to be. And what's interesting to me was the pitch wasn't really about saving the hospital money. The hospital wasn't really interested in a way, right? They can't publicly say it, but it's almost like, to your point, even a biopsy is not 100% positive. Even if the clinician says it's positive, there's a chance of being false positive just because we don't know. And so for any new workflow to change, there's too many risks, because if that workflow doesn't change, even if it's comparable to the standard, it's someone else's on the line because they will look bad. So sometimes it's better to say, well, it didn't work because it's the way we do it. And so at least it's not my fault. It's what everyone does, right? And so the way we pivoted to understand how the dynamics would change and where the money will flow, where the carrots stick, we realized in this piece, like 60% of the surgeries will have recurrence. And so doctor has to do 2, 3, 4 times the same surgery on the same patient. And that was a much larger pain than the lack of money that the hospital was making, because for the physician, the surgeon, ultimately, he doesn't want the liability of operating in the same patient in the same location twice. It's a big no-no, right? So in that case, the surgeon can go to the hospital and say, I want to adopt this. Like, you're not understanding, I'd rather not work than keep doing the same thing, because I don't want the patient to die in my hands. I don't care how you make your money. I just don't want the patient to die in my hands, right? And so it's so unique that, in a way, I'm hearing you say is all these market forces, everyone is their own island. And you have to understand how this own island operates within the whole system, which is the dynamics that makes the carrot and the stick, what makes people move forward and what makes people not move forward. And then ultimately, that clinical outcome is just a piece that probably is not as important as the grand scheme of things. Is that correct?
I think you're mentioning many correct things here. So, what you're describing is the inertia of the healthcare system. And it developed like this because it's, as mentioned before, a high risk environment. And no one wants to be the one responsible for something going wrong. And within that system, there's many, many different players with different incentives. And those incentives might be opposing to each other. So, in order to get them aligned, you need to understand those opposing incentives and you need to find a way to make it acceptable for everyone. And that's the reason why the STAR episode has like 7 success factors, like 7 different points. Some of them more important for one stakeholder and some of them more important for a different one. So, you mentioned something very important. Let's think of a startup which says, okay, if the hospital uses our technology, we can lower EHR admissions by 30%. And while medically and from a care perspective, that is awesome, the hospital wants those cases because otherwise they will not be able to bill, right? So the question then becomes how to align these incentives. And how we do it at the EvoMed, that we know that all the stakeholders involved get triggered by different things. The doctor wants something which is good for the patient, so quality of care. He wants something which is safe and which ultimately makes him look better. So if I'm the only one who has a cutting edge technology, and if a patient wants the best of the best, he has to come to me. For me as a doctor, this is great. So that's how we need to talk to the doctors. Then to the insurances, we need to go and say, okay, well, you should pay for this because we can lower the amount of operations in the example that you mentioned from 5 per patient or 3 per patient to just 1. So you just have to pay once. And then we can go to the hospital head, to the CFO and say, like, look, what this solution does is it lowers your 30-day readmission rate by 20-30%. So you actually, instead of operating the second time for free, run the risk to lose your profit margin because we can optimize for that. So you can do one thing which is good for everyone, but you need to communicate it to multiple people, multiple stakeholders in multiple ways. And you need to know who gets triggered by what and what their driver is, what their incentive is. And I'm a firm believer that for many more MedTech solutions than we see right now, something like that can be achieved. But it starts with accepting that things are that complex.
Okay, let's try to take one more point on it and then we'll move a little bit from the subject. But you saw that there's 7 points and there's different messagings to different types of stakeholders. You may say the right thing to the exactly right stakeholder, but ultimately the decision can still be no, or the decision stalled for like 12 months or 24 months, right? That most of startups will fail because it's too long. They can't keep sustaining business for 24 months without having a single income in. And if the premise is that we have all these 7 people and they're like an island, like what is our job? Our job is to be the connectors of these islands in ecosystems that we don't have any sort of ownership. And if we do that by being an outsider, it's sort of biased because they're saying, well, you only try to do that because you want to sell your product.
I
So
think
from day
you,
one, looks like we're losing.
well, the odds are stacked against us. That's true. But you actually are completely right. We need to be the one who is the connective tissue. That's how I see it. Because ultimately, all of those, in my book, I discussed this idea also in other podcasts, that healthcare is not an industry, but healthcare is a system. And because it is a system usually has one goal. And for healthcare, it is to better patients or to treat patients, to make ultimately people healthier with everything that it involves. So that's the end goal. And that's why the system has principles which apply to all healthcare systems, independent if they're in USA or here in Germany or in Asia. The same principles apply. So in the example that you said, the ultimate thing you want to do is to connect the interests of the stakeholders, and that's what your solution indeed should do. And I describe it as connective tissue because, well, let's start with that runway problem that you mentioned. To solve the runway problem, you don't need everyone to say yes. You just need like one or two or three people to say yes from all of those involved. I suggest to our partners, to the companies that I'm advising and consulting, to think about multiple business models or revenue models and how to achieve this. Because the efficiency gains that you would present to just the CFO of a hospital might be enough for him to say, okay, I'm going to reimburse you directly because I'm losing less money with your solution. While the payers are still outside and are not saying yes. But you would, if they see that something is like increasing efficacy, they might want to have a piece of the pie. So they are the next ones who can be connected into the system and can be connected into that network. Because ultimately, if they see that if someone is using your solution, the overall costs for the insurance drops, they will have an incentive. But it's only used in one hospital. But there we have proof that it works. So his incentive now becomes, we want to roll this over to all hospitals that we are paying to. And how do we do it? Well, we pay for it. And ultimately, we save more money than we do. And this is a basic economic principle. Your value is described by the value you create for someone else. So if I want to charge for my services amount X, I better make for my client that amount, so amount X times 10, right? And this is the principle which is universally applicable. And this is how a solution, a MedTech solution, becomes a connector between those stakeholders, is the solution who is positioned so strongly and so powerfully that they can indeed ultimately become something which changes how we think about delivery of care. And this is the standard that, in my opinion, we should strive for, because ultimately every doctor and many founders are in it to really impact healthcare.
I agree. I think one of the things that we recommend here at RaiseHealth is if that's the case, right? Like we have to understand that the market forces, there's some people that profit from the inefficiencies, right? Meaning like a drug that for a late stage cancer, it's more expensive than a drug for early stage cancer. Therefore, there are some folks that are not interested in creating a better screening device to catch cancer earlier. That's not the truth, right? It's almost like saying in EU, we have skin cancer screening covered, but in America, we do not. Why? Because doctors will make more money out of biopsies, and it's more profitable for you to have a late stage cancer, skin cancer, rather than catching early, because it's like a microsurgery where there's no money made to the system. There's no drugs to be sold. So that being said, what we tend to recommend here is not to fall in despair. You can't go and say, oh my God, the system's rigged, I'm not going to do this, and then start crying, right? If you're in this in this entrepreneurship, you're in that way a little bit of masochist. You like to pay. So what we'd say is You have to be very mindful of the chances you take. If your job is to be this connector and create all these relationships, maybe getting the first check for your family and friends, it's great, right? It will get you like alive, but you may take you to a place where you don't want to hear, which is you're going to become a zombie startup because then you won't be able to raise anymore. And raising, it's never about the first check, is what we call about the follow-on money, right? You get them through the door, you get their first check, but then you're like, hey, I need a bridge round. I'm doing a Series B. Are you coming? I give you a discount.
What round is OpenAI right now? Eight?
Sorry?
At what round is OpenAI right now? H?
Yeah, we call it D plus. After D, you can just ignore it. So, where I recommend to our folks is it doesn't matter who are the co-founders in a way. You can be the clinician, you can be the business person, but your job is to, as a startup entity, is to be connectors in the industry. It's to create relationships. So the first thing you should do is figure out really your team. And by figuring out your team is not like I'm hiring the guy from Cigna for 20 years. He has no report within Cigna because even within Cigna, if you want to change a workflow, you got to go through like 50 layers and you still don't know who is the decision maker. Like, but I was the chief medical officer. Even if you were the chief medical officer to give one command to go down to the provider level, like you get lost in translation. So where are we going is your first board, advisory board, independent is the most important piece. If you don't know how to sell this, you hire someone as a dependent advisor that is a sales rep, that his book of business has 100 doctors that day in, day out are solving the problem that you're trying to do. Because he will give you the inside out of like what makes the current problem that he's solving, why the sales is of that product he's selling that you're trying to disrupt, and how much money he makes. Why would he change his basket to sell yours? You need someone to be more like what we're discussing, like you care enough that they want to make a difference, right? But they also need to understand the game. Like talking to doctors and selling to doctors is not just because, right? There's this whole 20 products inside a basket. Every product has a margin. The rep's going to think about which one is going to spend the 5 minutes he has with the doctor to explain the stuff. So reps don't like to do education. So if you're changing workflows, you're doing education. Reps don't want to do that. So then the next thing you need to do is you need to understand like which KOL do I bring to the table. That's going to go to all these conferences, are going to do all the presentations, get all the folks from the medical boards to get together and push a statement that, yes, this is what we need to do. And so in a way, that's why it's so expensive to do healthcare, because the game has been played in a way that you need this balance sheet from the Johnson & Johnson to be able to do that. But not to say that's impossible. So by bringing the right advisors first, even checks, right? It's not that you're going to take the check from your dad. You should, because that shows to other investors that you have enough skin in the game that if you lose your money to your dad, you probably will, not be fine with it. But the investors that you bring, if they don't have the report and follow-ons, they can't introduce the right people. That money has no value, because I see time and time again, people raise like 3 to 5 million, but from like angel organizations, and they can't do the follow-ons, and then they die because they need to restart the whole raise again, like building that relationships, trust. And also investors don't really look at, I would say, at the company just because you have a good clinical outcome. They look at, can you execute on this or not, right? People call it grit, right? Do you have what it takes to push down boundaries after boundaries after boundaries and not play victim to the situation? So I think what we're exposing of like what it really means to be healthcare, right? What's this complication if it comes down to relationships, then even the finance side, you have to be, more thoughtful about how to be your team, how to position yourself, which one do you hire that gets you to the right places. Or it's to say why presidents will get rich after their presidency is not because of the presidency, it's about the relationships they bring to the table and that they get paid by speaking engagements.
Yeah, thinking about it like that, you're absolutely right. It's about building relationships. So how do you build relationships, or who do you build relationships to? And it's the same for investors. We advise investors on the same topics too. For them, we of course evaluate the startups, but ultimately, I think it comes down to being human. It comes down to the human connection. And I mean, independent of other factors, if you don't like someone, already up front you will already be thinking, okay, I don't really want to like interact with this person because I don't know, he's difficult, I don't like his sense of humor, whatever that is. And in that sense, I do think that it's just being human. And I mean, it is technology and it is business, but this human connections is the red thread connecting all of those different points. And that's the catch. All of them are important, right? And I think genuine human connection, that's some type of magic as well. No, I mean, when we met the first time, I think it's no secret we can disclose. I mean, we met the first time just before MedTech World in Malta last year. First online, and then we met there. And the human connection side, or just like resonating with the personality and resonating with who we were talking to, makes it actually interesting to stay in touch. Because if we wouldn't like each other, if I wouldn't like you, I don't think we would now be sitting here and talking. And we do have the other parts of business and venture that we talk about too. But in my experience, it becomes that much more easy and
Yeah.
that much more fun, and
Yeah.
it feels that much nicer because you have a genuine connection with someone. And although we're doing medtech, so it's technology, and finances, so it's numbers, in medtech we're still doing it for the humans. And I think that's a important and good guiding star as well, to keep in mind that whoever you talk to is a human too. And now, being a bit more technical about this, maybe a good tip is always to see, okay, are there interests who are similar, who are aligned, and maybe talk first about that before asking someone to write you a check of 2 million. I mean, you mentioned it before as well. No, you don't come up on the first date and say, ah, yeah, I want to marry you and have kids with you. I mean, it's a bit creepy. Ask me, but well, first ask them how they are, and then maybe ask them out for a date. And this is actually how, in my experience, the real big checks are written, because there needs to be a connection and there needs to be trust that you can deliver. And ideas come a dime a dozen, no? But execution is where it actually is important. And you also need to, the investor who you're talking to needs to fit you as well, because they have also their, I mean, I couldn't imagine a more stressful situation than taking money from someone I don't like. I mean, and then he wants it back tomorrow or whatever. It's,
Yes.
yeah, I think that's a good way to look
I
at it.
I'm gonna take a tangent here just to make it a little more fun. So when I heard you say magic, Harry Potter just came to my head. And just to close this episode out, what I understood is, in order for you to get accepted to Hogwarts, you have to have magic, right? You can't be an ordinary person. So in MedTech, is like you have to have your IP, right? Like, what is your mission? Like, that's your magic, your passion towards like improving something. That's what gets you accepted in the school. And then if you look at what Harry did, it's not that Harry was the most impressive wizard out there, but he had a dream that, Voldemort killed his parents, therefore he wanted like, and whenever people was like, don't say his name, and he's like, no, I'll say it. Right. And, and,
But how
and
did Harry
then,
Potter? How did Harry
yeah,
Potter make things happen?
exactly. And that's where I'm going. Ultimately, it's not whether he was from Gryffindor or Slytherin or right to your point. Probably don't act like Draco and Slytherin where you think you're the coolest kid in town, but actually no one likes you, right? And you get lonely in the end, and you probably die. But every house became friends with Harry. It didn't matter if you were Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw, right? In the end, everyone had the same objective. It's like we were not happy with Voldemort and their Death Eaters, and this whole dark world was not really working for us. So we do need a hero. And then everyone went behind him because ultimately he was a nice human being, right? He cared about his friends and he was righteous. And so I think it's a tangent that, it's like MedTech, I think is the same. Like you have to have your magic to get into the game, right? And after that, you start playing it. And it's about the relationships you build and then selling your dream. And it doesn't matter which color you're wearing, which Quidditch team you're at. But ultimately, it's like, can you rally the people into this common goal?
Exactly. So ultimately, in the beginning, Harry Potter wasn't the best wizard, also not the most talented. But the reason why he was able to make an impact was basically the connection he had to other humans. It was his ability to rally them behind his cause. That is exactly what you're describing, because what you're describing is pitching, right? And to be more technical, when we talk about raising money, pitching is one of the skills that you can hone and you can train. And it actually is a transfer of excitement and ideas to the people you need to like rally behind you. And it's a team sport, which then ultimately closes the loop to what we said before. It's not one stakeholder, it's not one person. It's many different people, many different stakeholders who then pull towards the same direction. And if we think about this behemoth, this Voldemort who seems so overpowered with all of his troops, destroys the magical barrier around Hogwarts and wants to walk in the front door, like something where you would think a few kids wouldn't stand a chance. In the end, there was one or two people on the other side who actually were on Harry's side, think Snape,
Yeah.
who then from the other side laid some basics or some small points where ultimately they could hook on and win in the end. So taking it to the MedTech analogy, it's exactly that. It's even if there's incentives against a certain procedure which is better, ultimately you might find someone who has your beliefs, although he's on the other side. And ultimately, don't despair. It just needs that magic just needs to happen once.
Yeah, that's so funny. It's also like we have to have clarity on how people make decisions, right? Like Snape was crucial in the end. And he didn't do it because he cared enough about the world, whether which side was winning, which side was losing. He just made a promise to Harry's mom that he was going to take care of Harry, whatever it took, right? And so it's funny, like a few times in my life that happened as well. Like the best mentors I ever found were not because they care enough what I was doing, because I was like a tiny speck of dust in every big things that they were doing. But maybe they saw themselves in me when they were young, and maybe I asked enough that like I was open and coachable enough that they particularly enjoy seeing the growth. Just yesterday, a friend to go have dinner with my family in Brazil. I couldn't be there because I'm here, but the friend is a big family office, and he took the time to go meet my brother and my mom in Brazil and their trip and their vacation just because. And so to your point, that human is potentially what takes you places and what changes the story, rather than too much focus on, I'm going to change healthcare because of this, even though that may be your bigger purpose. But the little human connections along your journey, it's what potentially changes the system, right? Because even Harry, if it wasn't for Snape and Dumbledore and the whole Voldemort world, like how does it end? Like, he has the most powerful wand in the world. So, all the stacks are against him. So I think that really closed in a funny way and a positive note that, to your point, like ultimately, yes, the odds are against us. Yes, there's like seven to more variables. Yes, we have to be the connectors. Yes, we have to figure out the chicken egg. But if you like this enough, the human connections you make along the way is what probably is going to change your story. Make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a great thing to take away from this podcast, no?
Yes. And so let's close this out. Let's give a little time to do a little more shot about EvoMed. Like, how can folks reach out to you? Who's your ideal type of support client?
Yeah, so where you can find me is LinkedIn. That's the easiest way. It's Amel Havkic. We'll probably have the opportunity to link it somewhere here. If you'd like to learn more about the STAR map and the principles or our industry report at www.evomed, so that's EVOMED consulting.eu. You'll find all of those resources free of charge. The book is coming out. We're going through the book launch at MedTech Malta in November this year. So we have 2026 just to like complete the picture. And yeah, if any of this resonates, just reach out. Let's talk. Let's build a human connection.
Well, Amel, thank you very much, and we'll make sure we put all the links below the video. But it was a pleasure to have you and be able to like be a little nerdy and close out with making a anecdote between Harry Potter and MedTech. I don't think people ever done that before, so this was very,
I,
very special, and I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, me too. It was great seeing you again. And one last thing, maybe here's a challenge to everyone listening: make memes, make Harry Potter MedTech memes, and let's flood LinkedIn.
That'll be hilarious. All right, everyone. This is how we end the episode. You guys get to sign up, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode.